Well, hi guys, thanks for joining. My name's Jeremy Branson, and I'm here with Andrew Reamer, the principal percussionist of the Pittsburgh Symphony, Chris Allen, acting timpanist and Saxon percussion, and then John Soroka, former principal percussionist of the Pittsburgh Symphony and emeritus player extraordinaire. And we're recording basically because we wanted to let our audience and our patrons know of a special person in our lives, and therefore, by extension, the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra had passed about a month and a half ago from the coronavirus. And we wanted to basically let people in on how special this person was, not only to us, but to percussion in general, and or at least orchestral percussion through many generations. And I thought it would be really cool to bring John Soroka in particular, because one of Alan Abel's very first students, I believe, was John Soroka. Is that right? When you were in Philadelphia as a student at Temple University, John?
Actually, Jeremy, I was quite young. I was already studying orchestra, and when some unfortunate circumstances entered Michael's life, Mickey, it just happened to be at the time night teacher. And I had the fortune of studying with him from the age of 9 through the age of 17, actually a total of 9 years at the music school. I have always publicly credited Alan as the person who put me together as a player, even though I had the great fortune of working with all of those members of the classic Philadelphia Orchestra section at the time. Weekly half-hour lessons in that ancient little studio at Settlement with primitive Neanderthal equipment, like, for instance, a wooden drum pad with gum rubber on the top. I'm sure you would recognize that, although those are relics today. And lessons with Alan were, for me, a great experience. Of course, in the 1950s, when you had the opportunity to work with someone like that, whatever was offered, you did unquestioningly. And I was the type of person that just followed instructions to the T, and, was thrilled to have him as my teacher. Also during those years, Alan formed a percussion ensemble, which was one of the first student ensembles in the nation, let's say pre-college student ensembles in the nation. And joining me in that adventure there at Settlement were people who went on to have illustrious careers in different aspects of the business. Russell Hartenberger and Bill Kahn of Nexus, the percussion ensemble. Mark Sunkett, who went on to become timpanist of the Phoenix Symphony and for many years taught at the university there in Phoenix until his passing. Michael Udow, who ended up taking over Charles Owen's position at the University of Michigan, and for 30, 40 years was in the Santa Fe Opera Orchestra. We didn't quite know at the time really how much of a treasure that experience was. Of course, with old age comes wisdom. So what I could say is that I valued those years, and it was only in retrospect, after truly getting into a professional career, that I was able to understand how much was gifted to me. I would like to say that while so many people tend to maybe move in the area of remembering Alan as a great player, and he certainly was, and I do not mean to take anything away from that by saying that my strongest memory of him is one of being a great human being. The gifts that were so freely given were offered from his spiritual foundation and a desire to help everyone of drive maximize their potential, and he never closed the door. The door was always open, and the point was, if you did your work, he did his work. So I was very, very fortunate to have him in my life at that point, and of course throughout all the rest of the years of my career and beyond.
And how many years, John, were you? I mean, I feel like once we were his students, we're sort of always his students. But in the sort of Webster's dictionary sense, how many years would you say that you studied with him? As again, for lack of a better term, as a student in the traditional sense.
That would be the experience at settlement was 9 years, and that was before I went to Temple University to study with Charles Owen.
Gotcha. Yeah. And then I think, Andy, you were the next student in at least our Pittsburgh Symphony lineage. Am I right?
I would believe so. Yeah, there's a bit of a gap from John to me, but not much of a gap.
I would just like to point out, John started studying with Al when I was born. Born in 1959, which is just amazing.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah, I started with Al. He was started at Temple University, but I knew of him because I grew up in the Philadelphia area, and I used to go to the Philadelphia Orchestra from when I was, junior high school and earlier, and so I was really a student of him and watching that section and hearing that orchestra for many years before I actually started taking lessons. But I did go to Temple University, and I started with him as an undergrad. I guess it was my senior year at Temple, and then I stayed for grad school and studied 2 more years. And then this is a great time that Chris and I share. We were both hired to be the extra percussionist when Muti took over the orchestra from Ormandy. So for many years, Chris might remember how many, we split basically the 4th percussion chair with Philadelphia Orchestra. And, to be down in Alan's basement for lessons, and I had a pair of special lesson shoes. They basically had like a 1/4-inch sole on them, and I still hit my head every lesson. But to be down there and get feedback when you were playing was one thing, but then to watch him and be with him and that section on the stage and hear how they made their parts fit and to watch how they listened, that was actually some of the greatest teaching that I ever had, because he wouldn't necessarily have time or be able to talk about where to put a single triangle note in a lesson. That's so abstract. But when you're on stage and you heard him do stuff like that every single time he played, that really affected me and opened my eyes up and opened my ears up. And that section just worked like that all the time. And Alan was a master at, you know, conveying what the music was about. And, you know, John said it, that the spiritual aspect was very real to him. Some of my great memories of playing were on that stage, but also he used to asked me to join him when he added percussion at his church. And we would lug equipment up to some balcony or something in the old church and play some cantata, something like that. And I have a lot of fine memories of doing that, playing with Alan there, but always, you know, always open and willing to show you and share and give feedback. Just priceless. Priceless times.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the basement thing, because you and I are both tall. Well, we're all tall, but I think you and I are the tallest of the four of us. And yeah, Mr. Abel's basement was, I want to say the clearance was 6 feet and 4 inches, maybe.
Not where the heating block went.
Yeah. So
you have the scars to prove it.
Yeah, so there were many times when you know,
Began as if I may, in my years at Temple, I had many opportunities to perform as a sub or extra with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and can attest to the experience we've all had, especially those of us who were able to work with the section with Fred Hinger around and Charlie Owen and Mickey Buckspan. A very unique experience.
Yeah.
And Chris, tell us about you, when you first started your tutelage with Alan Abel.
I didn't begin studying with him in the dictionary sense until grad school. That was 1981. But in spite, and I studied with him for just 2 years, other than all the times I would go back and play for him, etc. But even though John started from the age of 10, which is such a young age, 9, sorry, and studied with him for 9 years, and I only studied with him formally for 2 years in grad school, probably just like you, Jeremy. But he, and this applies to all of his students, he was as formative and as dedicated to in my life as I think he was to John, or that whole generation of guys who began studying with him when they were children. But once you were his student, this is the amazing thing about him, is he was dedicated to you and everything about you for his entire life. And that spans generations of players. You know, John said he started in 1959, and he was teaching a Zoom lesson 2 weeks before he contracted the virus a couple of months ago. So all the way from 1959 until 2020, he was teaching with the same level of dedication. And, you know, John spoke about how he gave and gave and gave. And the most amazing thing about him was that once you were his students, all he did was give and give and give. And I did my undergrad at Curtis in Philadelphia. So I heard him play for 4 years, studied with him that way, just from making the observations, as Andy was talking about before we started formally. But even before I began studying with him, when in my generation, when you went to Temple, he had, I believe, 4 students. That was it, 4 grad students, no more than that. And we all got a free ride, but you had to have certain things. You had to have an automobile because you had to get to his house for lessons. And also back then you had to get to Temple. And you had to buy a cassette recorder. So you make all your little tracks. The Dr. Beat had not been invented, and cassette recorders are very expensive. And that was, what you had to provide in return for your lessons. I lived downtown Philly, going to Curtis, didn't own an automobile. My dad bought me this 1973 Volkswagen Beetle, which immediately, the first week that I got it during the summer, prior to beginning lessons with Al, broke down, and I couldn't get out to his house, and we hadn't even begun studying yet, but my car was in the shop, and he lent me his car for 2 weeks. I drove his car, and he just made do, sharing, carpooling with his wife with their other car. But for 2 weeks I drove around his car, no questions asked, and that's the kind of man that he was. And he did that his whole life. And my car, every time I went to lessons, I didn't hit my head on the ceiling like you guys. But during the remaining year I had this Volkswagen, it was constantly, and invariably I would leave my lesson, go up from the basement, and the car wouldn't start, and I'd be out there. The next student would come in, and when the next student lesson ended 2 hours later, I'd still be out there under my car trying to get it started, and Mrs. Abel would be bringing me tea to keep me warm, and Al would come out, and get his wrenches and figure out what we needed to do to get the car started. And that happened for over and over and over again. But that's just the type of person he was with everyone for decades and decades and decades and generations of students. It was truly an amazing gift. John talked about the gifts that we all received, and every one of his students has the same experience, and the gift that he and to all of us are just unimaginable, even in our industry, where there are people similar to this, but no one who goes that far as he did.
If I might jump in.
Of course, yeah.
Along those lines of the gift, I was well along in my professional career, and I don't remember where we were. We were together somewhere, Alan and I, and somehow he brought up a story from my childhood, and what he relayed to me in this each of you and of viewing the type of person Alan was. He read that I'd come up during those years against several hurdles, which had I not gotten past them, would have precluded a professional career. And what he mentioned was that week after week, he would go home and figure out something else for me to try. Dive down the rabbit hole, come up with another trick, technique, idea, thought, phrase, turn of phrase, suggestion. And I would walk into my lesson and just heard, okay, try this, go home, do it. Okay, try that, go home, do it. Also, most importantly, though, was that never was a sense of insufficiency, failure, you're up against a wall. Nothing like that was ever relayed. All that was relayed was a new idea to work and a continual sense of confidence in you as a human being.
Mm.
And I'm sure that all of us here together have faced certain obstacles, and we may never know what Alan devised in order to get us beyond those points.
Yeah, I agree. I guess in a way, I benefited studying from Mr. Abel in part because, I mean, the three of you guys were very much legends in the percussion world. And so to a certain degree, there was, people would give advice. So, okay, if you're going to study with Alan Abel, here's a way to sort of get even more out of his instruction than you would otherwise. So a few people along the lines gave me some tidbits. So for example, I would always try and, first of all, lessons of course were always at his house. And I felt that was especially helpful to all of us, because the first thing you got when you walked in was he would either make a cup of tea or his wife Jan would make a cup of tea, and you were basically, I don't know if he originally started doing this intentionally, but it ended up becoming intentional, that you ended up becoming basically a family member. And you were always in his house, and you were always sharing, you know, space and meals with them. And that was a very purposeful thing, at least by the time I got there. And I think that informs to a certain degree his methodology of always fostering our development as students, whether we are young students or adult professional students. I would always try and get lessons that were either right before lunchtime or right after lunchtime, or at the end of the day, because if it was right before lunchtime, then I knew that our lesson would go a little bit long, and I could get a little extra time. And he would, without fail, he would say, "Oh, why don't you stay for lunch? I'll make a sandwich." And then he would just talk about the music business, and he would tell little bits of information that you would not normally get in a 1.5 or 2 hour lesson, just to hear the guy talk and kind of find out what makes him tick. If I got a lesson after lunch, I would always show up half an hour early for the same reason, because he would say, "Oh, you're early, come on in. Let me tell you about this one time where I played this piece and I did this." But the primo lesson spot for me was the very end of the day, because if he got the sense that you were really into it and you were playing well, and then sometimes a 1 or 2 hour lesson would turn into 4 or 5 hours of just golden information. And I just knew from the grapevine that every single second and minute of that guy's brain and knowledge that you can take, just soak it all in like a sponge. And basically, I think that sort of advice was passed down along through the generations of players, to where I feel especially lucky that I sort of was one of the later people that got it, right? So, and I studied with him, I feel, even though I'm not young, I feel particularly young because I started studying with him in 2003. And I went to graduate school at Temple. And I would always go back and play for him when I was getting ready for auditions and things like that. And but he was sort of a surrogate father to me in a way. And I think part of it is, as you guys have mentioned, his unfailing capacity to care for all of his students as if they were his children. And there was never a time when he would say, "Oh, listen, I don't have time to help you with X or Y." He would say, "Okay, well, let me look at my calendar, and why don't you come over to the house, or why don't you do this or that?" And in turn, I always liked helping him out with various projects, like whether it was moving stuff or I remember painting a bunch of doors and trim at the Ardmore Presbyterian Church on Saturdays because and of course I was happy to do it, but I also knew that if I was sitting there painting with him, I could sit and chat with him and kind of pick his brain a little bit. Because he's very much like Yoda. He's just got so much information and great stories and just a wonderful way about him that you just want to spend time with him. It was very soul enriching, I felt, to spend time with him. And I've been going back. I actually recorded every single lesson I had with him, either on cassette or mini disc player, and I've been going back and listening to some of them, and there are just gems of information that I feel really fortunate that someone told me, "Hey, you should record all your lessons, even if you go back 20 years later and listen to them," which I am doing, of course. I'm really thankful that I did that. The very first time, you reminded me, Andy, the very first time that I ever technically shared a stage with Alan Abel was at one of the Ardmore Presbyterian Sunday church services. I can't remember what I played, but I remember turning to him at one point in the rehearsal, and I said, I asked him a question. I said, "Mr. Abel, do you want me to play this way or that way," or something to that regard. And he turned to me and he said, "Jeremy, we're sharing a stage now, so we're colleagues, and you can call me Alan." and I said, "Okay, Alan." And I said, "I'm sorry, that just feels too weird, Mr. Abel. I can't do that." And I've never called him Alan, just because not that it was disrespectful or anything like that to say so, but it just always felt like I could never be this person's equal, so I can't call him by his first name, yeah. And so tell me,
Can I jump in?
Yeah, of course.
Just for the listeners who are still learning about Alan Abel, sometimes on stage at Heinz Hall, we would refer to Alan as the Big A. And we might jokingly, kind of half jokingly, say to each other, "Well, I wonder what the Big A would do here." So he wasn't tall in physical height, but tall in stature in the percussion world. And one of you guys mentioned something about the generations. I think it was you, Chris, and John. You studied with him from so long ago. He was also teaching at his first gig in Oklahoma City, before he came to Philadelphia. But sometimes there's any person in the orchestral world who's had as many students and grand students and great grand students as Alan Abel. You know, I don't know if you could ever document that if someone's tried. I mean, he showed me a list of all his students, probably about, I guess it's about 8 years ago. And, you know, it was 4 or 5 pages of players in orchestras, single spaced in orchestras, mostly in the States and around the world, and colleges and, you know, working professionals. It's just extraordinary influence. And it's because, you know, he loved what he was doing, and he had Jan with him all the time. And she was a great supporter of his, and yet her own person. Can I launch into a story?
Yeah,
Andy,
absolutely.
I'm gonna interrupt you for 1 minute, because all those students that he has and all the students that are playing in orchestras all around the U.S. and the world, it's important to point out that those numbers don't come from the number of students that he taught, because he only ever taught 4 at one time. It wasn't like he had giant classes of 10 or 15 or 20 people that he was teaching. He only ever had 4 students at a time, and still he has all these enormous numbers of people who were playing all over the world. Go ahead.
Well, we talk about going to his house for lessons, and they were always so charming. But one time I went into his front door, and Jan came right up to me and squared her shoulders and got real close to me and said in a look, "Poppy has had a difficult morning. He was trying to install a vanity in the bathroom upstairs." Silence. That's all she said. So I thought, whoa, that's pretty loaded. But so we go downstairs, and Alan came down, and he started in with this story. He had been trying to, it's a small bathroom at the top, a wood case, very nice looking, and he got, it left a mark. But I remember Jan kind of prepping me, and you know, so yeah, very, very passionate guy in everything he did.
Yeah, he often. So I didn't know this until he passed, but apparently when he first started working as a musician in Oklahoma City, and then also early on in Philadelphia, those jobs, they weren't full-time jobs, and they didn't pay a salary, so to speak, in the 50s and early 60s. So he would supplement his income by being a carpenter, and he would help frame houses and stuff like that. And I felt that was particularly poignant, given his spirituality and his giving nature, that of course he was a carpenter. But he would always refer to himself as a frustrated carpenter. But there was nothing that he couldn't tinker and fix and make better when it came to a little mechanical thing here and there. And some of the best lessons that I think I ever had in my life with him, I didn't play a single note. We would go down into the basement, and he would say, "Well, do you have this particular mechanical device for this instrument?" And I would say, "Oh, no, I don't." And he would say, "Okay, well, let's go out to the shop and I'll make you one." And so for 2 or 3 hours, we would just spend time in the shop while he made while he fixed a snare drum throw off, or made a triangle holder, or or something like that. And those, you know, even though I didn't play anything, those were some, in my opinion, those were some of the most precious moments of lesson time with him, because I got to see a different side of him that functioned the same way, but you know, it's interesting to see the machinery from another perspective, which I always enjoy. Yeah. So yeah, are there any, you know, do any of you guys have any stories or anecdotes of things that you could say where you can point to a moment or a time where there was a lesson or something that was fostered by him to you as a young player, or even as a you know, as a professional in your career, where you thought, wow, I'm really glad that he once told me or demonstrated this or that, and I'm glad I used it. I'll give an example. So I remember the first time when I was in the Pittsburgh Symphony, when we played Rachmaninoff's symphonic dances. I was playing, among other things, a snare drum part. And in the last movement, there's this very tricky metered spot where everything kind of dies away, and the snare drum and the cello play together. And it's this odd metric modulation that is often a little hairy in any orchestra. And I remember Mr. Abel told me once, he said, look, there are going to be if you ever play this, there are going to be one of three ways that it's going to go. You're going to have a great conductor who knows how to get out of the way and just let the orchestra do their thing, and then it'll be fantastic. You're going to have an orchestra that's not, you're going to have a conductor that's not really sure of themselves, and so they'll try and help, and they might make things a little bit better, but they might gum up the works a little bit. And he said, and the third is the worst, where you're going to have someone who thinks they're helping and they're doing a really good job, and they're making it much, much worse. And so I remember when Andy made the assignments for this, and I went home and I recorded. I got in front of a video camera, and I recorded myself being a conductor, and I pretended to be a really bad conductor and a really good conductor, and I tried to come up with a bunch of different ways to do it, and then I would practice looking at myself, and I thought, if Alan Abel, I'm really glad he sort of clued me into this part. And so the week came and the concert went fine, and I remember I called him up afterwards just to chat with him, and I mentioned this, and he said, oh, well, can you email me that video, because I'd like to give it to the students now so they can practice it that way. Which is not what I was expecting, of course. I just thought it was a project for me, but to me, that's something that kind of sticks in my head. Is I'm really glad that he mentioned something like that, and it stuck in my head, and I was able to find what I would consider an Abel type solution. But then, moreover, he's a perpetual teacher, and so instead of just saying, "Oh, that's a great story," he went, "Oh, really? Listen, that can help all the other students that are here now. Can you send it to me so I can pass it on?" And I just thought that was always the generous nature of him.
Along those lines, this perpetual teacher, he was also a perpetual learner as a teacher. And, we all, after we're done with our formal training with him, we would all go back, the year later or 2 years later or 5 years later or 7 years later and play for him. And he was always developing, and he'd always learned something different. And, you know, the way that he taught me to play something, you know, in 1983, I'd go back, play to 1987, and he said, "Oh no, I found a much better way to do that now. You know, I'm learning all the time, and I found a much better way." And I'm sure this, you know, occurs right up until now. And that's something that I really took away from him. He was always learning from all his students and passing everything that he learned from each student, using it to help other students. And goes back to what John was talking about how he would try to find a way to get you, his student, to overcome whatever barriers you were facing at the time. And this never dawned on me until John mentioned it, but now that John put it this way, I don't ever recalling him showing any disappointment in a lesson. And you could tell he was disappointed, but it was only because you would do something and he'd say, "Oh, okay." And there would be a little pause while the gears turned around and there, "Oh, okay, well, let's, all right, well, how about we try it this way?" And then he would come up with some way, something for you to work on to try and get it better. But that was the extent of any disappointment that he ever showed in a lesson, and that really never dawned on me until John mentioned it. But these gears always turning and always trying to improve things, using the struggle that any student has to help another student down the road, you know, be it next week or 30 years later.
The only other sign of this was in those early days of the percussion ensemble at Settlement, with all of the names that I mentioned and more. If things weren't just going absolutely perfectly, we could tell when the top of his head turned red.
And speaking of the top of his head, I don't know, Andy, I don't know if you were on this gig. We were playing years ago at the Mann Center, which was their summer home. It was in the summer concert, and we were playing Charbier España, which has a giant, long tambourine solo. And Al was playing the tambourine solo. And for whatever reason, I don't recall, the guest at this concert was the Philly Fanatic, who, for anyone doesn't know, is the mascot of the, and Andy, you and John may know this. I think he was one of the first mascots ever. I think that was the mascot before any of the other teams had mascots.
Yeah.
And this guy was just I can't remember his name, David. Oh, I forget his last name. But he was a regular fan, and he decided he wanted to do this, and he built this costume for himself, and he became the first mascot. He was very famous, the Philly Fanatic, and he was the guest at this concert, doing all sorts of goofy things. He was very humorous.
It looked like Big Bird, but it was green.
Yes, yeah, the green Big Bird. That's right. And while Al was playing this very long, you know, tambourine solo, that's a big audition lick, the Philly Fanatic came back and polished his head, and then put his big Philly Fanatic snout on top to kiss it. Were you there for that one, Andy, or was it only I on that?
I think I remember that. Yeah. Yeah. And Al didn't miss a beat.
No, he didn't miss a beat. And back then, this was probably, I'll bet this was in the early 80s. Al was always bald, but back then in the early 80s wasn't like now. No one was bald back then, because except for Al, everyone had toupees. Excuse me. No one would ever be seen being bald back then. So unlike now, where you see, 20% of the men are bald. Back in those days, all those men had to pay, and but Al was one of the only bald guys. So that was a big gag back then in the early 80s because no one else was bald.
Yeah.
And so that reminds me of a story that that he told me once, and to me it illustrates sort of how just wholesome Mr. Abel was. And so it was some concert that he was playing. It was being televised, and it was some contemporary piece, and he was playing snare drum. And at the very end of either the piece or the movement, he had this snare drum ostinato pattern that would diminuendo and just trail off into nothing. And it was just him. And evidently the cameraman or the producer of the show came up to Mr. Abel before the shooting and said, "Look, at the end of this, just so you know, we're gonna zoom in on your hands and the snare drum, and we're gonna superimpose Riccardo Muti conducting. So the very last thing that's going to be shown is you and the conductor." And Mr. Abel was never one that, at least that would strike me as one that would get nervous, but he said that he that kind of rattled him a little bit, and so he wanted to be in a good mood, so he would be less nervous. So what he ended up doing was he went into his wife Jan's jewelry box and got a clip-on earring, and he put the earring on backstage so that every one of the musicians walking by would kind of give him a hard time about it and say, what are you doing with an earring, Al? And they would make jokes and they would get him in a good mood. And so right before the concert started, he took it off and he explained how he was now in a good mood. And I just thought that was, again, the most sort of wholesome possible solution to the problem of getting nervous, right? I mean, and it was, to me, that's something that it really encompasses his point of view, right? How can I deal with this issue of getting nervous with what I'm doing, in a very just afternoon school special kind of way. And also it'd just be funny to see a short bald guy with one earring that was probably orange or something like that.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Well, so I was thinking recently of some out of character moments of Mr. Abel, which I didn't end up experiencing until later on in life. There was a big, as we know, there's a big percussion convention every year, and it is commonly in Indianapolis, but Mr. Abel is sort of a bit of a celebrity there. And I was when I was a student, every once in a while after a concert or something like that, or after a long lesson, he would say, "Look, let's go out to dinner." There was a Chinese place next to his house that he and Jan liked to go, and it was very inexpensive. It wasn't a big deal, but he would always insist on paying, and I often felt really bad because I would pull out $5 or $10, and he would say, "No, you can pay when you have a job in an orchestra." And so one time at this convention, I say, "Look, Mr. Abel, can I take you out to dinner tonight?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I don't think we have any plans." So we went to this steakhouse near the convention center. And I told him beforehand, I said, "Now listen, you're not paying for this because for years you told me I could never pay until I have a job. And now that I do, I'm letting you pay. And he thought about it. He was like, no, I'm not going to let you do that. And then he did something that really blew my mind, just because he always has this sort of wholesome, he's a very wholesome guy. And the waitress came over and said, can I get you a drink? And he said, he looked at her and he said, yeah, Jack Daniels on the rocks. And that just blew my mind for some reason, because he's certainly not a drinker, but apparently back from his days in the Air Force, that was, when he would drink, that was, when he'd have a drink with a nice dinner, that was his drink. But that totally blew my mind. And he looked at me kind of like, what are you so surprised about? And I said, this is the guy that would put an earring on, to overcome nervousness. But, because I never really heard him swear or anything like that. And it just never occurred to me that, that he would just order, whiskey on the rocks every once in a while. And Jan said, well, that's of a special occasion drink. So I was wondering if you guys had any stories about things, very out of character moments, that I guess that's not at all scandalous or anything, but relatively speaking, that seemed scandalous.
I think
to
that's
me at the
about
time.
as scandalous as it gets.
But yeah. So yeah, he every once in a while he was Andy, I think I'm not sure if it was you or someone else that was telling me a story of a time when the Philadelphia Orchestra used to do a Halloween concert where everyone would dress up. And one year he dressed up as I believe it was Groucho Marx, and he had a little a bicycle horn with him.
Oh.
And at the very beginning of the concert, the orchestra tunes and then the lights go completely out, and it's very quiet. And in the complete darkness, you just heard one single bicycle horn go, Berkey. And that was just sort of a sense of humor. Every once in a while, just a tiny little jab of wholesome humor.
You broke up again, Jeremy.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Jeremy looks frozen. There we go.
Okay. You're back. You thawed.
Yep.
Yeah,
No,
sorry,
I'm
my
still
internet
here.
connection is slow us interrupted. Well, I mean, all of us, the four of us are all.
I have to get going.
And Andy is the only section in the orchestra where we all studied with the same person. We bring the same musical sense to our performances, the same sense of timing, the same approach to the instruments. And I think it's very unique in the orchestral world to have one singular section where everybody, all of us, are the children of a particular master.
Mhm. Yep. Well said. Yep.
Been a great privilege.
Yep. Yeah, it can affect. It's about a process of thought of sound production on all the different instruments that we have to play, and a communication, nonverbal communication when we're on stage and playing, that we all witnessed and we were part of, and that's one of the joys I have in playing with you guys and with this section. There's a kind of a oneness of thought about what instrument would sound right in a certain place, and just what instruments sound good, period. What percussion instruments. So we often have a lot of choices to make with the sounds that we're required to produce. And we just tend to think very similar in terms of sound production, and that's because we listened and we heard, some of the Alan and some of the same great players for so many years, mostly in Philadelphia Orchestra. But yeah, thank you for that, John. And for Chris, I know, Chris, you have to go. Thanks.
Thank
See you
you.
guys. Thanks.
Thank you,
Jeremy. Great
everyone.
job.
Thank you,
Good to see
Jeremy.
everybody.
Yeah. Let's hope we see each other soon.
Yeah.
Indeed. Be well.
Eventually.
All right. Stay
All right.
healthy.
Take care.